Aria Blackwood had always been the shadow at the edge of every gathering, the rejected omega no alpha wanted, the girl whispered about but never seen. On the night of the mating ceremony, when she expected nothing but fresh humiliation, fate betrayed her in the most unthinkable way. She fell asleep on the Alpha King's shoulders, under the eyes of the entire pack. In that single moment, the outcast no one valued became the center of every whisper, every judgment, and every dangerous desire. And though Kael Stormfang, the ruthless Alpha King, claimed he did not want a mate, his wolf had already made its choice. Aria Blackwood had always known her place at the bottom of the pack, the word Omega carved into her identity like a brand she could never wash away. And though she moved quietly through the village paths, her presence was always followed by whispers, snickers, and the kind of pitying glances that cut deeper than open insults. For the pack saw her as weak, fragile, someone meant only to serve and never to stand. And yet inside her chest, where no one could see, a stubborn flame of yearning refused to die, whispering that perhaps one day she might belong, might be seen, might be loved. Every morning began the same way. Hushed laughter from the training grounds as warriors mocked her clumsy attempts, sharp words from dominant wolves reminding her she was nothing, cold stares that pushed her to the shadows. And though she lowered her head and kept her silence, her heart ached with the weight of rejection, aching even more when she watched others her age embraced by friends, siblings, or potential mates. She dreamed at night of standing tall, of someone reaching for her hand without disgust, of being more than the invisible shadow she had become. And though each dawn shattered that dream, she clung to it secretly, because without it she feared she might crumble completely. Now, as the day of the mating ceremony drew near, the air in the pack shifted with electricity, wolves bustling to prepare, laughter and excitement flowing like a river she could never step into, and she found herself standing at the edge of the clearing, arms wrapped around herself as she listened to the joyous chatter, wishing she could melt into it instead of standing apart like a ghost no one wanted to acknowledge. The women fussed over their dresses, polishing their hair until it glistened under the torchlight, while the men boasted loudly of who would claim the most beautiful mate. And though Aria tried to appear indifferent, her chest tightened with every word, for she knew she would not be chosen, she would not be admired, she would not even be noticed unless it was to be mocked. Elder Magnus's voice carried through the air as he gave orders to ensure the ceremony's perfection, and she obeyed silently when told to fetch or carry, moving like a shadow between the glowing lanterns that now lined the paths, her mind whispering with cruel honesty that she was nothing more than a servant in the eyes of those who should have been her family. Still, as she adjusted the flowers on the altar, her fingertips brushing soft petals that smelled faintly of night jasmine, she allowed herself a fleeting fantasy that perhaps, by some miracle, she might walk into the ceremony and someone's eyes would soften when they met hers. Someone would see her not as a burden, but as a girl with a heart desperate to love and be loved. Someone who might, just for a moment, make her feel like she belonged. The fantasy was fragile, a glass bubble ready to shatter, yet it sustained her through the long hours of work, through the sharp rebukes when she moved too slowly, through the whispers that she should not even attend, that her presence would taint the sanctity of the night. Aria's hands trembled slightly as she straightened the ceremonial cloth, and though she lowered her gaze, her mind rose high into her secret world of hope, where the cruel laughter did not reach her, where she could breathe without fear, where she could stand without shame. But reality returned swiftly with each harsh command, each deliberate shoulder bump as others passed, reminding her of her place, reminding her that when the music began and the pack gathered, she would be the one standing at the very edges, unnoticed, unwanted, yet still yearning in silence. The moon that would rise for the ceremony already loomed, large and silver in the dusky sky, casting pale light across the clearing, and she shivered as though it could see her secret longing, as though it mocked her for daring to hope, but she could not stop herself, for somewhere deep inside, beneath layers of pain and rejection, her wolf whispered that her story was not yet over, that something waited for her, even if she could not yet imagine what it was, and though she dared not speak it aloud, the thought burned quietly within her, carrying her into the night. The clearing buzzed with life as twilight deepened, the glowing lanterns casting flickering shadows across the grass. And though Aria kept to the edge, her ears caught the hushed excitement threading through the crowd, whispers darting from one wolf to another like sparks in dry grass, each carrying the same name with reverence and fear. The Alpha King, Kael Stormfang, was here, and even those who prided themselves on strength lowered their voices when speaking of him, as if his very presence demanded caution, as if the night air thickened because he walked among them. Aria felt her pulse quicken despite herself, curiosity and dread tangling in her chest, for she had grown up on stories of his ruthlessness, tales of battles won with rivers of blood, of rivals silenced by a single growl, of a wolf so powerful that even alphas bent the knee. And though she told herself she was beneath his notice, her body betrayed her with trembling fingers and a nervous flutter in her stomach as the whispers grew louder. A hush fell suddenly, like the forest itself was holding its breath, and Aria's gaze, despite her will, was drawn forward to the center of the clearing where the crowd had parted. And there he was, Kael Stormfang, standing tall, shoulders broad and unmoving, every inch of him carved in dominance, his presence so commanding it seemed to reshape the space around him, pulling all attention without effort. And though he said nothing, though he barely moved, the weight of him pressed against her chest, making it harder to breathe. His hair caught the faint silver of moonlight, dark strands glinting like obsidian, his eyes sharp and cold as winter steel, scanning the gathering with a gaze that seemed to pierce through flesh to the soul beneath. And the murmurs of the pack swelled, fear and awe blurring into one as wolves shifted uneasily, some lowering their eyes, others stiffening with forced bravery. Yet none could truly stand equal to the force that radiated from him. Aria told herself to look away, to keep her head bowed, but when his gaze swept across the crowd, moving from face to face with slow precision, it lingered where it should not have, and her breath caught as the impossible happened. His eyes stopped on her. For a heartbeat, she thought she imagined it, that he was looking past her into the shadows, but the sharpness of that stare pinned her in place, and every nerve in her body screamed that he truly saw her, saw the Omega who had always been invisible, saw the girl who had always been forgotten. Heat rushed to her cheeks as she lowered her head instinctively, yet still she felt it, the weight of his stare refusing to release her, like invisible claws hooking into her very soul, dragging her out of obscurity and into a light she had never wanted to stand in. The wolves around her noticed too, their whispers shifting in tone, sharp edges of disbelief threading through the hum of voices. For Kael Stormfang did not look at Omegas, he did not spare them a thought, and yet here he was, eyes locked too long on the one wolf everyone else dismissed. Aria's heart pounded so hard she feared it might echo, and her palms dampened with sweat as she tried to steady herself, reminding herself she was nothing, reminding herself that men like him did not see girls like her. But the air clung heavy with the undeniable truth that, for a fleeting moment, he had. And though she longed to disappear, she also could not deny the spark almost of something dangerous unfurling inside her chest, a spark she dared not name, a spark she feared might consume her if she let it grow. The moment his gaze released her, Aria stumbled back into the blur of sound and movement around her, heart still rattling against her ribs, as if it could not believe it had survived the weight of his eyes. But the relief was short-lived, for the crowd shifted and pressed, and from the sea of faces emerged Celine Ravenshadow, her cousin, draped in silk that clung to her like the moonlight itself had chosen her as its favoured child, her lips curling into a smile that carried no warmth, only poison. And before Aria could retreat, Celine's voice rang clear enough for those nearby to hear, sharp as a blade dressed in sweetness. "How curious, little Aria, standing here among us as if you belonged, as if anyone might choose you." Laughter rippled in response, cruel and eager, and though Aria bit her tongue to keep from trembling, the sting of humiliation spread through her veins like fire, burning more fiercely because Celine always knew where to strike, always knew that the mere mention of belonging was enough to twist the knife deeper. Celine stepped closer, her perfume cloying, the gleam in her eyes triumphant as she tilted her head, feigning pity. "Don't tell me you actually hoped tonight would bring you a mate. Poor thing, even the weakest of alphas would rather stay unmated than bind themselves to a shadow like you." The pack members nearby smirked, nudging each other, feeding on the cruelty like wolves scenting fresh blood, and Aria fought to hold her composure, fingers curling tightly around the hem of her plain dress, wishing the earth would open beneath her and swallow her whole before another laugh cut across her skin. She tried to turn away, to slip back into the safety of the shadows, but Celine reached out and tugged lightly at her sleeve, stopping her escape. The gesture casual yet dripping with dominance, as though she wanted everyone to see that even here, on the night meant to celebrate destiny, Aria was nothing but a plaything. "Careful," Celine whispered low enough for only Aria to hear, though her eyes sparkled with malice. "You'll make a fool of yourself again, and wouldn't it be tragic if the Alpha King noticed?" The words sliced through Aria, a fresh wave of shame colliding with the memory of his piercing stare moments before, and though she longed to deny, to protest, her throat closed tight with fear that Celine would twist any sound she made into further mockery. The music began to stir then, drums thundering low, voices lifting in song, the ceremony swelling around them with vibrant life. But to Aria, it felt distant, as though she stood behind glass, cut off from the celebration, trapped instead beneath Celine's watchful cruelty. Others brushed past, dresses whispering, laughter spilling, and every bump of a shoulder reminded her how small she was, how unseen, except when she was being pulled into the spotlight as the joke, the target, the omega to be ridiculed. She stared at the glowing torches flickering along the edges of the clearing, wishing she could vanish into the shadows beyond. But even as she fought the urge to run, her senses sharpened to the shift in the crowd. A ripple of silence moving outward as though the air itself had been disturbed, and though she did not dare raise her head, she felt it again. That presence pressing against her, heavier than any hand, colder than the night breeze. And without looking, she knew whose eyes had found her once more. A shiver ran down her spine, not of fear exactly, but of something more complicated, something she did not have the courage to name. And though Celine continued her whispered cruelty, though the crowd hummed with cruel amusement, Aria's chest tightened with the undeniable awareness that she was caught between two worlds, the scorn of those who had always sought to break her and the dangerous gaze of the Alfie, a king who should not have seen her at all, yet somehow had. Aria's breath stuttered as she felt the weight of his unseen stare anchoring her in place, and though Celine's smug words continued to drip like venom into her ear, the world around her seemed to still, the music softening, the laughter dimming, until the only thing she could sense was the steady, deliberate approach of footsteps cutting across the clearing, each one striking against the earth with a rhythm too heavy to belong to anyone but him. And her chest tightened as her wolf stirred uneasily, caught between fear and an aching pull she did not understand. Then Celine fell silent mid-taunt, her smirk faltering as shadows shifted, and Aria, despite every instinct urging her to keep her gaze lowered, felt compelled to lift her eyes just enough to see the impossible. Kael Stormfang standing before her, taller than she'd imagined, his presence so consuming that even Celine, who had never bowed to anyone without performance, faltered back a single step. The space between them shrank until Aria could feel the air itself tighten, the atmosphere heavy with his dominance, and though he said nothing at first, the silence was louder than any words, pressing on her ears, pressing on her heart, until she thought she might collapse beneath it. Finally, his voice came, low and rough, like thunder held barely in check, the kind of sound that could shatter stone if it wished. And the single word carried enough command to freeze the crowd that had begun to whisper again. Enough. His gaze slid briefly to Celine, who bowed her head reluctantly, lips pressed thin, before his eyes returned to Aria, sharp and unyielding, as though he sought to strip away every layer of her until only truth remained. She wanted to look away, to fold herself back into nothingness, but she could not, her body betraying her as her gaze locked with his, her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that hurt, and when he spoke again, his words seemed to coil around her like a chain, inescapable. Be ready. 2 simple words, nothing. More, yet spoken with such weight that the meaning was unclear. And though she searched his expression for clues, his face remained unreadable, carved in stone. His eyes unreadable save for the faintest flicker of something she could not name, something that made her wolf whine softly in the depths of her soul. The pack around them shifted uncomfortably, whispers rising in confusion, some daring to exchange glances as if to confirm that they were not imagining the Alpha King of all wolves addressing a mere Omega, and the heat of their scrutiny burned against Aria's skin until she wanted to flee, but Kael's presence held her rooted, as though his voice had bound her to the earth itself. Celine's eyes narrowed with thinly veiled rage, her nails digging into her palms as she stepped back fully now, unwilling to risk further defiance in front of him, and Aria, caught in the storm of silence that followed, could only swallow hard against the knot in her throat, her mind racing with questions she dared not voice. Why had he spoken to her? What did he mean? Why did his gaze linger as if searching for something only he could see? Her body trembled with the weight of it, her soul torn between terror and a strange, fragile flicker of something dangerously close to hope. And before she could steady herself, he turned, his cloak shifting with the movement, like a shadow stretching across the ground, and walked away without another word, leaving her gasping in the wake of his command, surrounded by a pack whose eyes now burned holes into her, the whispers swelling like a tide she could not escape. Yet through it all, the echo of his voice clung to her mind, 3 syllables replaying endlessly. Be ready, be ready, be ready, until she feared she might never know peace again. Aria could still hear his voice echoing in her skull long after he had turned away. Those two simple words, sting inside her like threads of fire that refused to unravel, and though the crowd quickly filled the silence with a frenzy of murmurs, she barely registered them, her pulse still racing with the weight of a moment she could not explain. And when the music swelled again and the laughter returned, she slipped quietly into the edges of the ceremony, seeking air, seeking space where eyes would not follow her with judgment, her feet carrying her down a narrow path lit faintly by torches, until she found herself standing alone beneath the trees at the clearing's edge, the cool night pressing against her overheated skin like a balm. She drew a shaky breath, pressing her palms against the rough bark of an oak, whispering to herself that it meant nothing, that his words had been nothing more than passing command, that the Alpha King had no reason to notice her beyond silencing Celine's cruelty. Yet the whisper of her wolf in the back of her mind betrayed her denial, stirring uneasily as if it knew something she did not. She closed her eyes, trying to still the storm within, when the air shifted again, heavier, colder, charged with the same suffocating dominance she had felt before. And before she could turn, before she could flee, his voice came again, closer this time, softer, but no less commanding. "You run from shadows that aren't yours." Her heart lurched as she spun, finding Kael standing only a few paces away, the silver light of the rising moon catching on the hard angles of his face, his expression unreadable, yet his presence filling the narrow space like the forest itself bent to accommodate him. Words tangled in her throat, fear and confusion locking her tongue, but he stepped closer with measured calm, his gaze never wavering, as if every flicker of emotion that crossed her face was being weighed, studied, dissected. "You carry scars," he said, his voice low, a growl woven beneath the syllables, not cruel, but certain, as though he could see beyond flesh into the marrow of her being, and her breath hitched because he was not wrong. Though no marks marred he, a skin tonight. The scars she carried inside were deeper than any blade could carve. She began, but her voice cracked, shame prickling her skin, and she lowered her gaze, bracing for mockery, but it never came. Instead, silence stretched, and when she finally dared to glance up, his eyes had softened just slightly, enough to make her chest ache, enough to make her wonder if the stories of his cruelty were incomplete, if there was something beneath the armor of his dominance that no one else had seen. She wanted to ask why he had spoken to her, why he had chosen to notice her when so many stronger, more beautiful wolves stood waiting in the clearing. But her lips refused to form the questions, fear of his answers rooting her still. Then, almost without thought, she lifted her sleeve, revealing the faint scar that ran along the inside of her wrist, a relic of a childhood accident that had nearly cost her life. One she usually hid for fear it would be taken as weakness, but tonight the urge to show him was stronger than her instinct to hide. His gaze fell to the mark, and though his expression did not change, something flickered in his eyes, something fierce and unreadable, and for a heartbeat she thought he might reach out, might touch the scar as though to claim it, to claim her. But just as quickly the moment broke, a rustle behind them shattering the fragile stillness. Aria flinched, tugging her sleeve down as Celine's mocking laugh echoed faintly from the path, her voice sharp with false sweetness as she called for Kael, pretending innocence though the venom laced every syllable. The Alpha King did not turn immediately, his gaze lingering on Aria for one last heavy moment, the silence between them saying more than words could, before he straightened, his expression closing off once again, and stepped back into the shadows of duty, leaving her breathless, shake. and painfully aware that something had shifted between them, something fragile, dangerous, and utterly impossible to ignore. The sound of Celine's laugh still lingered in the air long after Kael had turned away, its sharpness biting at Aria's ears like a warning bell. And as she stood frozen in the shadows of the trees, she felt the atmosphere of the ceremony shift, the chatter of wolves thick with curiosity as whispers began to ripple outward, carrying fragments of what had been seen, fragments of what Celine had already begun to twist with her poisonous tongue. By the time Aria stepped hesitantly back toward the clearing, she could feel the weight of every stare, the sharp edges of judgment pricking her skin like thorns, and though she tried to blend once more into the background, her name slipped between lips like venom. Omega, disgrace, daring to tempt, until she wished she could claw the words from the air. Celine moved through the crowd like a queen, her smile painted sweet but her eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction, each step deliberate as she recounted a version of events that never happened, a version where Aria had shamelessly thrown herself at the Alpha King, desperate and pathetic, a version that stoked the laughter of those eager for scandal, and the sound of it hollowed Aria out until she felt her chest might collapse beneath the weight of their scorn. Lyora tried to move to her side, her friend's face pale with worry, but the crowd pressed too tightly, forming a circle that caged her in, their voices growing bolder as the whispers turned to accusations, as jeers rose sharp against the night air, and someone hissed, "She doesn't deserve to be here," while another spat near her feet, forcing her to step back with burning cheeks. The torches seemed to blaze brighter with every cruel word, throwing her shame into harsher relief, and though she searched the gathering for Kael's imposing figure, he was nowhere to be found, his absence cutting deeper than the mockery, because without him she was defenseless, a lamb thrown to wolves that had always hungered for her downfall. Elder Magnus's voice rose above the crowd at last, his tone stern but edged with disdain, demanding silence, and when the voices hushed, his eyes, cold and unyielding, fell on her, narrowing with suspicion as if Celine's lies had already found root in his mind. "You shame us," he said, the words heavy, final, and though he did not shout, the quiet authority in them was enough to make the pack stiffen, enough to make Aria's throat close as tears pricked her eyes, for there was no defense she could give that they would believe. The circle shifted again, bodies pressing closer, the air suffocating, and her wolf whimpered deep inside her chest, cowering at the rejection, but her feet refused to move, nailed to the ground by humiliation and fear, by the knowledge that no matter how desperately she longed to vanish, she was trapped in their gaze. Celine's voice carried once more, honeyed and vicious, suggesting that perhaps Aria should be removed, that her presence tainted the ceremony, that her audacity was an insult to tradition, and though the crowd murmured in agreement, Aria's heart hammered louder, a frantic rhythm of panic that drowned out all else, for she could feel the walls of scorn closing tighter, the voices circling like wolves scenting blood. And still Kael did not return. Her breath came shallow, each inhale a fight against the rising tide of despair, and though her eyes burned, she forced them open, staring up at the full silver moon that hung above, whispering a silent plea to it, to the night, to anyone who might hear her prayer, that she would not be broken here, not in front of them all, even as her knees trembled and her chest constricted, and for a fleeting moment she wondered if this was what Celine had wanted all along, not just to humiliate her, but to crush her spirit so completely that she would never rise again, just as the silence after Elder Magnus's words stretched so long it threatened to suffocate her. The air split with a low, dangerous growl that vibrated through the ground itself, freezing every wolf in place, and Aria's head snapped toward the sound, her breath catching as Kael Stormfang emerged from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, his presence like a storm descending, his dark cloak rippling with the night wind, his silver eyes burning with an intensity that made even the boldest alpha step back, and the circle that had closed around her moments ago broke instantly, wolves stumbling to make room for their king as the weight of his aura crushed them into silence. The mocking smirk on Celine's face faltered, though she lifted her chin as if to mask her unease. But Aria saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, just as she felt the smallest thread of relief unravel in her chest, though it warred with a deeper dread. Because Kael's expression was unreadable, his jaw hard, his steps deliberate as he strode forward, each one echoing like a drumbeat in her ears. He stopped before her, towering and unyielding, his gaze sweeping over her as if taking in the tremor of her hands, the sheen of tears she had refused to let fall, the defiance buried beneath her shame, and when his eyes lifted to the crowd, the silence thickened into something heavy, electric, unbearable. "Who dares accuse her?" he demanded, his voice a blade, smooth and lethal, slicing through the night, and though no one answered, the guilty glances that shifted towards Celine betrayed the source, drawing his sharp attention to where she stood, her painted smile wilting beneath his stare. Celine tried to recover, her voice soft and falsely sweet as she said she had only spoken what she saw, that Aria had overstepped, that she had embarrassed them all. But the moment the words left her lips, Kael's growl deepened, reverberating in his chest, sending shivers down Aria's spine, and the crowd seemed to shrink further, cowed by the fury radiating from him. "You dare twist lies about what belongs to me," he thundered. "Ed," and the gasp that rippled through the gathering nearly stole the air from Aria's lungs. Because though she heard the words, her mind stumbled over them, struggling to grasp their meaning as her heart stuttered violently in her chest. Celine paled, her composure fracturing, while Elder Magnus's face tightened with shock, his authority wavering beneath the Alpha King's claim, and though whispers hissed like sparks in the night, none dared speak above a murmur, none dared challenge the dominance that rolled off him in waves. Kael stepped closer to Aria then, closing the space between them until the heat of his body pressed against the chill that had wrapped around her bones, and his hand lifted slowly, deliberately, as though daring anyone to stop him before he brushed his thumb across her cheek, wiping away the trace of a tear she hadn't realized had escaped, the gesture so intimate, so fiercely protective, that her knees nearly gave way beneath her. "She is mine," he declared, each word deliberate, final, echoing into the night like a vow carved in stone, and the crowd bowed their heads instinctively, submitting to his will, though the shock on their faces lingered, though the disbelief still hung heavy in the air. Aria's lips parted, but no sound escaped, her thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief and confusion, yet beneath it all, her wolf stirred, stretching for the first time in years, responding to his claim with a surge of warmth that frightened and comforted her in equal measure, as though some deep part of her had always known this truth. Kael's gaze softened by a fraction when it returned to her, though his voice remained iron as he turned to Elder Magnus, commanding that no one dare question her presence again, that no one touch her without his consent. And the elder, though visibly unsettled, bowed stiffly, acknowledging the Alpha King's word as law. Celine's fists clenched at her sides, her fury poorly hidden. But she was powerless now, her schemes unraveling in the face of Kael's declaration. And though Aria should have felt victorious, all she could feel was the dizzying rush of fear and longing that threatened to consume her as the world around her blurred. The torches flickered in the sudden wind, the pack lowering their gazes as Kael placed his hand firmly on her back, guiding her forward out of the circle of judgment, his presence shielding her, his claim undeniable, and though her heart raced wildly, she could not stop herself from leaning into the warmth of him, as though her body knew before her mind could comprehend that in this moment she was safe. The world still buzzed with stunned silence as Kael's hand pressed firmly against the small of Aria's back, leading her away from the circle of wolves who dared not raise their eyes, and each step felt unreal beneath her feet, as if the earth itself no longer rejected her weight, but finally accepted it under the shadow of his claim, the whispers fading into nothing against the thunder of her heart. And though fear and disbelief tangled within her, there was also a fragile thread of warmth winding through the cracks of her chest. Fragile, but undeniable. When they reached the edge of the clearing, away from the judging stares and cruel smirks, Kael stopped, turning her gently to face him, his hand lingering just long enough to steady her trembling frame before his piercing eyes locked onto hers. The fire in them softened though the storm still lurked beneath, and in that moment she could not look away, could not breathe without feeling the weight of his presence pressing into her soul. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, rougher, but no less commanding. "You will not bow to them again, Aria Blackwood." The sound of her name on his lips sending a shiver through her, a strange mix of reverence and promise that unravelled the knot of shame still clinging to her ribs. She tried to answer, tried to ask why he had claimed her, why he had stood for her when no one else ever had. But the words dissolved in her throat, tangled in the storm of emotions she had no language for, and instead only a faint whisper escaped, trembling and raw. "Why me?" And though she feared his answer, she needed it, needed to know if this was mercy, strategy, or something she dared not hope for. His gaze held hers, unflinching, and the silence stretched long enough that her pulse pounded painfully in her ears, until finally he said low and certain, "Because you are mine." The simplicity of the words carrying a weight greater than any oath, and though doubt still fluttered within her like a trapped bird, something deep inside her wolf stirred, responding instinctively to the resonance of his claim, as though some ancient truth had been spoken aloud. The night air wrapped cold around them, but his presence was fire, steady and consuming. And as he lifted a hand to brush an errant strand of hair from her face, she flinched. Not from fear of him, but from the strangeness of being touched with such deliberate care, for no one had ever held her as something precious, and the tenderness in his touch broke something open in her that years of rejection had buried, and a single tear slipped free before she could stop it. Kael's thumb caught it, his jaw tightening at the sight, his voice dropping into a vow. "No one will harm you again. Not while I draw breath." And though the promise sounded impossible, dangerous even, the conviction in his tone made her believe, if only for that heartbeat, that maybe it could be true. Behind them, the ceremony dissolved into uneasy silence, the pack too shaken to resume their festivities, and though Aria knew whispers would spread, knew resentment would fester, none of it seemed to matter in this moment, not while his shadow shielded her from the storm, not while the bond she had never expected curled like a flame low in her chest, fragile yet alive. She searched his face, the hardness of his features, the strength carved into every line, and yet beneath it all she saw something else flicker there, something he quickly masked but could not hide completely. A flicker of vulnerability, of need, and it rooted her feet when every instinct screamed to run. It steadied her when the world still felt ready to collapse. The moonlight spilled silver across the clearing, painting his eyes with an otherworldly glow, and though the night was far from peaceful, though danger still lingered in the edges of the silence, she allowed herself to breathe for the first time, allowed herself to imagine, if only faintly, that she was not an outcast anymore, not invisible, not forgotten. His hand found hers, large and steady, wrapping around her trembling fingers, anchoring her as he murmured, "Stand tall, Aria." And though her voice failed her, her body obeyed, her shoulders lifting, her spine straightening, as if his words had reached deeper than flesh, into the marrow of her soul. For the first time, she stood not as a rejected Omega, but as something more, something that even she could not yet name. And though fear still clung to her, though doubt still whispered, there was no denying the truth etched into this night. She was no longer alone, no longer unseen, no longer unwanted. And as Kael guided her away from the clearing, their hands still bound, the torchlight fading behind them and the forest path opening ahead, Aria felt the crushing weight she had carried her whole life lift just enough to let a spark of hope flicker, fragile but unyielding, a spark that whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something she had never believed she deserved. And though the road ahead would be dangerous, though the pack's judgment would not vanish overnight, the warmth of his touch promised that she would not face it in the shadows again. For in the arms of the Alpha King, the once rejected Omega finally felt the stirrings of a belonging that could not be stolen, and in the quiet of that moment, under the watchful gaze of the moon, she allowed herself to believe that her story was not one of disgrace, but of becoming,